Hey friends, I've been making edibles for over 10 years now, and I still get questions I've never heard before. And that's what I love about this community and doing this show. You keep me on my toes, really. So here's what's happening. In a couple months, I'm doing a listener Q&A episode, and I want your questions. I haven't done a Q&A in about 3 years. The weird ones, the basic ones, the ones you've been too embarrassed to ask, the ones you've Googled 3 times and you still don't really have a clear answer. All of it is fair game. Maybe you've been trying to nail your dosing and it's just not clicking. Maybe you've got a batch that went sideways and you want to know why. Maybe you're just curious about something you've heard on the show and you want to go deeper. Maybe you're curious about Bite Me itself. Ask me. You can send a voice message if you want to hear your own voice on the show, or just drop your question in writing. Either way works. The link to submit is in the show notes, and I appreciate you for listening and for being a part of this community. And I really appreciate you trusting me with your questions. Stay curious and stay high, friends. Now let's get into today's episode. Welcome, friends, to episode 358. And today we're talking about Alice B. Toklas and the rebels who ate their weed. Hello, friends. I'm your host, Margaret, a certified ganja and TCI certified cannabis educator, and I believe your kitchen is the best dispensary you'll ever have. Welcome to Bite Me, the show about edibles. Grab a snack or a cool drink, and let's dive in. All right, so before we get into today's topic, I'm pretty excited about, and I think you'll see why as soon as we dive in. But I've got a few things to share first. And one is a fan mail that I got recently. And this one comes from a listener all the way in Australia. Loved this episode, Dr. Margaret. A great series. And I'm about to re-listen to your tolerance break interview with Madison. Wonderful work. And I just want to say thank you so much for that message. You can send your own fan mail message by, I think there's a button somewhere in the show notes on your podcast platform that you're listening on. And I did reply because I can now reply, and they replied to me. Unfortunately, that is as far as it can go with fan mail messages. But the episode in question that they were referring to was the episode that I did on the endocannabinoid system. And if you want to learn more about that and why it's important, then I suggest you go and have a listen to that episode. I think it's called The ECS Explained. And also that tolerance break episode that I did interview that I did with Madison was really great as well. Some of you out there may know him as Free Nugs, and I think that's in the title of the episode. It was done a little while ago, so I can't totally remember. A lot has happened since then. So thank you again for that message. I always love hearing from listeners because it reminds me that I'm not, speaking out into the ether. There's somebody else on the other end. You can now leave a voice message when you do a fan mail message, if that's an option that you would like to partake in. You can always also send me an email or a voice message through SpeakPipe. The links are all in the show notes. Reach out if you dare. You may just have it read on the air. And that rhymed, and that was totally unintentional. And also just a little bit about what's happening in my life right now. It was recently my birthday, and that was one of the reasons why I did that birthday watermelon mint fizz recipe. If you haven't tried that yet, I really suggest that you do. I've tried it a couple of ways now. One with, I guess, cartoned. I was going to say bottled, but it was in a carton watermelon because the first time that I went to go try this recipe out, the watermelons were insanely expensive. And I was like, this is incorrect. So I tried it a different way, and I've tried it since with the actual watermelon when I found one at a more reasonable price point. So happy birthday to me. I did kick off not long after my birthday with a camping trip with just a couple of days out in the woods with my daughter and her dog, who had never been camping before, and that was an adventure. The first night was kind of rough, not going to lie, but I brought edibles, so everything was okay. All right. Now, I want to talk about a cookbook, and this isn't just any cookbook, but it is a cookbook that got somebody arrested, and that cookbook contains probably one of the most famous accidental recipes in culinary history. And it was written by a woman who was, by her own accounting, mostly just trying to keep the party going. And if you ask me, that's my kind of woman. So just picture it. The year is 1954, Paris. And Alice B. Toklas is sitting down to write her memoir. Now, if you don't know who Alice B. Toklas is, here's the quick version. And I am going to diverge here for a second and just mention, I'm assuming Toklas is the correct way to say it. I actually haven't looked it up. I see it written. I've known about Alice B. Toklas for many years, but have I ever actually heard anybody else say it out loud? I'm not sure that I have. So if I'm saying it incorrectly, apologies. But she was the life partner of Gertrude Stein, one of the most influential literary figures of the 20th century. And for nearly 40 years, Alice and Gertrude ran one of the most famous salons in Paris. Their apartment at 27 Rue de Fleurus was basically the living room of the modernist movement. Think Picasso, Hemingway, Matisse, F. Scott Fitzgerald. They all came through this salon, and Alice cooked for them. Gertrude got the credit for being a literary genius. Alice fed the genius. She also managed the household, handled the correspondence, typed the manuscripts, and by all accounts ran the entire operation, while Gertrude got to be the star. So when Gertrude passed away in 1946, Alice was left alone in her 80s, dealing with grief and the practical problem of what to do with 40 years of stories and recipes. So she wrote a cookbook. The Alice B. Toklas Cookbook was published in 1954, and it's not what you'd expect. It's part memoir, part recipe collection, part social history of Bohemian Paris, and part extremely dry wit delivered with a straight face. Alice was funny in a way that people are funny when they have no patience for foolishness. And that sounds like many an 80-year-old that I know. She had opinions, she had standards, she had recipes that have been tested on some of the most celebrated artists of the 20th century. The cookbook is wonderful, and if you can ever get your hands on it, you should read it, even if you don't ever make a single thing from it. Because I'm sure if you've ever looked at cookbooks from the 50s, you know that what they decided was delicious, quite different than the standards we have today. And I am thinking immediately of something like tomato aspic. I don't even know if that's a 50s thing or not, but I just feel like tomato and Jell-O don't really go together. But here we are today because of one specific recipe, that Alice almost didn't include. One recipe that, when it was included, changed everything. The recipe wasn't Alice's. It was submitted by her friend, the artist and writer, Brian Geisen, who was a member of that whole wild expatriate circle. He sent it to Alice for the cookbook. She included it. She apparently thought it was funny. The recipe is called Hashish Fudge. And I want to read the introduction of it because it is one of the most interesting pieces of cannabis writing I think ever put to paper. She writes, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't want to reproduce the whole thing verbatim, but the gist is she describes it as something that anyone can whip up on a rainy day, capable of providing euphoria and brilliant ideas. And then she lists the ingredients, which include spices, dried fruit, nuts, and cannabis. And she notes very casually that the amount of cannabis should be adjusted to what is locally available. That's it. That's the whole warning label. The American publisher, Harper & Row, either missed it entirely or decided not to worry about it. The cookbook was published in the United States with the recipe intact. It was only when it was reprinted in England that anyone noticed. The British publisher caught it and removed it. And so there are first editions of this cookbook circulating with the recipe and editions without it, which has made the first edition a collector's item. The recipe itself is definitely not a fudge. It's more of a pressed fruit and nut situation. No baking, no heat. You grind your cannabis, you mix it with the spices and dried fruits and nuts, and you shape it and you eat it. I've done many recipes like that on this show before. It's essentially what you'd call a raw cannabis preparation today, which is interesting because the decarboxylation question wasn't even part of the conversation in 1954. Whether the THC was even activated is a whole separate topic. And that also is interesting as well because I just recently interviewed Robin Swan, who talks about why we shouldn't decarb, especially in a more medical context. some people who want to preserve terpenes or preserve some medical properties of the cannabis would infuse it into the fat, where there is a low amount of decarb happening during the infusion process, where you're going to have the result of a much less potent result. I'm thinking too much about this, but in this particular instance, she's just grinding up the weed and putting it right in the fudge. It's hard to say how potent those will be. Maybe we should all try it out. But here's what matters. This recipe put cannabis in a mainstream cookbook in the 50s, published by a major American publisher in the mid-1950s at the height of reefer madness, with essentially no comment and no alarm. And the sky didn't fall. The children were safe, and life went on. Alice B. Toklas had been making food for artists and rebels and geniuses for 40 years. Of course, she had included a cannabis recipe. It probably didn't seem remarkable to her at all. And here's what I love about this history, and what I think connects directly to why I do what I do. Eating cannabis has always been an act of a particular kind of person. The people in Alice's circle were not interested in what they were supposed to do. They were interested in what was possible, what could be created, what could be experienced. They used food and, yes, cannabis as part of a broader philosophy of how to live. The Beats picked it up from there. The counterculture of the 60s made cannabis brownies practically a symbol of the whole movement. And somewhere along the way, making edibles became its own form of quiet resistance. Not loud resistance, not political marching, though some people did that too. Just the act of saying, I'm going to make my own. I'm going to decide what goes in it. I'm going to choose my dose, my kitchen, my rules. And that's exactly what I mean when I say that your kitchen is the best dispensary you'll ever have. This has always been about autonomy. Alice wasn't selling anything. She wasn't a brand. She was just a woman with decades of knowledge, recipes collected from everywhere, and a healthy disregard for what she was supposed to include in a polite cookbook. It feels very much like ask for forgiveness, not for permission kind of scenario. The glamorization of this history can sometimes skip over the whole part where people got hurt. The legal consequences of cannabis in that era were not a joke, and they did not fall equally on everyone. The bohemian Paris crowd had a particular kind of protection that most people didn't have, and I don't want to romanticize that part. What I do want to celebrate is the spirit of it, the willingness to treat cannabis as an ingredient, a medicine, as a whole part of a philosophy of living well. That spirit is why this show exists. So what do we take from Alice B. Toklas in 2026, or in this, whenever you might be listening to this, future listeners? A few things. First, edibles have a longer, weirder, and more interesting history than the dispensary industry would have you believe. Cannabis and food is not a new idea. I'm sure all of you inherently are aware of that. People have been doing this for centuries across cultures in ways that have nothing to do with a glossy plastic package with a QR code on it. Second, the rebels who ate their weed understood something that we talk about on this show constantly. The dose matters, and knowing what you're eating matters. Even in 1954, with no regulatory framework and a very casual attitude toward the whole thing, Brian Geison's recipe included a note about adjusting the amount. The basic awareness that you should probably think about how much you're consuming has always been there. Which brings me to where I always land. Please use the Bite Me dosage calendar before you make any infused batch of anything, especially if you're working from a scratch recipe or adapting something. The link's in the show notes. It's on the website. It's always free. Do the math before you eat. Alice maybe didn't have that option, but you do. And third, I think this is the thing I want to leave with you here today, is that there is a long, real, documented tradition of people treating cannabis as food, as medicine, as part of a creative life, as something worth cooking with and thinking about seriously. And you and I are part of that tradition when we make edibles in our own kitchen. You're not doing something new. You're doing something very, very old, but with better information. And if you want to dig into this topic more, I'd recommend trying to track down a copy of Alice B. Toklas's cookbook. It's been in and out of print, but it is findable on the internet archive.org. I borrowed a copy of Alice B. Toklas' cookbook from internetarchive.org, and I read an excerpt from the Hashish Fudge recipe at the end of this episode. And read it for the writing, not just for the infamous recipe. In fact, the infamous recipe actually doesn't necessarily sound that good to me, but Alice was a hell of a writer and a sharper observer. And then she's usually given credit for, probably because her longtime partner was so well known. And if you've got thoughts on this, or you have your own history with edibles that connects to a bigger story of why people have always wanted to cook with cannabis, I would love to hear it. Leave me a message on SpeakPipe or email me at stayhigh@bitemepodcast.com. I appreciate you spending this time with me today, and I look forward to many more moments together, friends. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with someone else who would also enjoy it. And until next time, my friends, I'm your host, Margaret. Stay curious and stay high. I did find the exact recipe from thehashmuseum.com, and I will look for more online because I think it's super interesting. But her recipe, and this is in quotes: take 1 teaspoon black peppercorns, 1 whole nutmeg, 4 sticks of cinnamon, 1 teaspoon coriander. These should all be pulverized in a mortar. About a handful each of stoned dates, I think she means here pitted dates, dried figs, shelled almonds, and peanuts. Chop these and mix them together. A bunch of cannabis sativa can be pulverized. This, along with the spices, should be dusted over the mixed fruits and nuts kneaded together. About a half cup of sugar dissolved into a big pat of butter, rolled into a cake and cut into pieces or made into balls the size of a walnut. It should be eaten with care. 2 pieces are quite sufficient. Obtaining the cannabis may present certain difficulties. It should be picked and dried as soon as it has gone to seed and while the plant is still green. It should be picked and dried as soon as it's gone to seed. What kind of weed were they growing back then? Am I right? Oh, how times have changed, my friends.